I will talk in my presentation about research ethics reviews beyond the biomedical sector and the experience we have in UREC and what we might learn from this experience for those new types of ethical reviews. UREC is the European Network of Research Ethics Committees, and it started with medical recs only about around 2005. But it includes also in between representatives of others than medical recs. And this is also the background of a position paper we published in March 2021. And I come back to this position paper, but let me start with a brief description of the background of this position paper and the status quo here. So a system of ethical review of research projects plays, I think, a significant role in modern research already for many decades, at least in the medical sciences, or let me say in health-related research. And against the background of research participants being abused for research purposes in the past, the review by recs has been introduced to protect those human research participants in medical studies from harm. And therefore, independent recs support scientific and technological innovations involving human participants in the research and development phase by reviewing research projects from the perspective of scientific soundness, ethical justifiability, and compliance with legal requirements. The extent to which recs should also look at scientific soundness is controversial, but the overwhelming majority is certainly in favor of saying that only methodologically well-prepared research is also ethically justifiable, especially if it's associated with risks. But also the other point, how deep recs should look at the legal requirements is not always clear. For example, in relation to data protection, many medical recs often refer instead to data protection officers and don't do this type of assessment themselves. But in line with the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, it's agreed that human dignity in particular must be protected in any scientific and technological development, and not only in medicine. However, research ethics committees do not only help to protect human participants in research from risks, but also protect the researchers themselves through this consultative process. So UREC feels particularly committed to this process that is established especially in medical research. However, based on the experience of many inquiries we currently receive at the UREC office from researchers, research institutions, members from research ethics committees, we need to pay particular attention to four central observations. First, more and more ethics reviews are being requested by research funding bodies and scientific journals, even outside the field of medicine, where they are not legally required. Second, there are only a few research ethics committees established outside medicine for ethics review of research, most likely in disciplines like psychology and sociology, less often in technical disciplines. And due to this requirement, we often receive calls from researchers who are desperately looking for a competent ethics committee. I know about several well-designed research projects that could not be conducted because of a missing rec opinion, since there was no one at the university and the funding organization skipped the funding. And this happened also in the past at my own university, I must confess. Third, when such research ethics committees are established outside biomedical research, the national structures for a joint exchange of these research ethics committees are unfortunately often lacking. And this is very problematic for a kind of national representation of national regs on the European level. And my fourth point, the demand or the demands on researchers to reflect ethical aspects on their own research have grown more and more during the recent years. But researchers often do not know where to turn, who should they contact, and EUREC serves here very often as a kind of clearinghouse. So the reason why we are being asked these questions about extended forms of an ethics review is that society's sensitivity to ethical questions in the research process has grown. So the reasons that funders and academic journals are asking for an ethics review is precisely because of the increased ethical sensitivity in society. And this means that it is not only about social debates and political process in the topic, it's the responsibility of national ethics councils, but it's also about the ethically sensitive research process itself. And this is a matter of trust in research. In addition, people have become aware that not only physical interventions in the human body, as in medical studies, or in many medical studies, can cause harm, but also other methods, such as interviews with sensitive questions or the unauthorized use of personal data. And there is a fundamental ethical responsibility of researchers for their own activities and for the impact their research has on society and the environment. But whether ethical reviews help or are a solution here is not self-evident. Researchers are also have critical review on that. Some researchers outside medicine react sometimes angry and frustrated. They believe their work is being constrained and distorted by regulators of ethical practice who do not necessarily understand the research process. And these critical researchers argue that regulators are acting on the basis of biomedically driven arrangements that make little or no sense to other scientific disciplines, whether these are in technologies, computer science, mathematics, or the humanities. Many researchers state that they do not want to become colonized by the methods and ethical principles of medical researchers. Even researchers who are generally in favor of institutionalized review procedures and actively participate in them indicate the weaknesses in everyday procedures such as incompetent, contradictory, and poorly coordinated feedback and requirements. So the willingness to reflect on questions of research ethics is not only extensive, but part of everyday business. Nevertheless, many researchers would like more exchange and orientation, especially on new research ethics issues that arise, for example, in connection with digital technologies, social media, and changes in the research situations due to the internet. Nevertheless, there are major reservations about the establishment of ethics committees here, as there are fears, and against the background of international experience, rightly so, that these procedures will be one-sidedly orientated towards legal discourse and bureaucratic logics. Another concern relates in particular to the technical disciplines. Researchers, but also in my experience, also students argue, we only provide methods and tools, but the ethics starts with the application, and that's the task of other people than the researchers. And therefore, ethics committees and the review process need to be able to develop procedures that respond appropriately to these concerns and the diversity of methods. They also need to consider how stakeholders like members of the civil society, I mean, in medicine, these are the patient groups, but in computer science, these are the users, but also funders, publishers can be involved. And that leads to new ethical requirements with regard to the relation between science and society. Products of research change our entire world more and more profoundly in a positive way, but sometimes also with negative side effects for society, human nature, the natural world around us. And therefore, research can only be conducted in an ethically sensitive and responsible way in science and the humanities. In this context, ethical reflection is not only required at the application stage of a technology, of a system, etc., but already at the research and development stage. So it's not just only just about the application models. Moreover, due to the worldwide interconnection of research institutions, the changes encounter different social contexts and value systems in a globalized way. An internationally well-organized ethics review system may also help to fight against ethics dumping in research. A particular challenge of many disciplines is the use of personal data. And we have clearly seen this in the pandemic. A lot of data, also personal data, are indeed for the development of vaccines and for model simulations of the spread of the virus, or when it comes to the development of apps to track infected or endangered persons, or in behavioral or economic studies, how people behave and what effects this behavior has for our societies related to our quality of life. In other words, data protection becomes a major challenge in many types of research, especially when personal data are being transferred outside the European Union. And even for pandemic scenarios, for example, modelers are not medical doctors, but mathematicians and computer specialists, and often they do not work at the medical faculty where there usually is a ethics committee. In those cases, only a few research ethics committees exist. However, the ethical questions posed to research do not only concern the immediate protection of research participants, but also a broader responsibility of researchers, as formulated, for example, in the European Code of Conduct of the All European Academies ALEA, where the fourth ethical principle for researchers states respect for colleagues, research participants, society, ecosystems, cultural heritage, and the environment. Therefore, the European Commission has for a long time already included a kind of ethics self-assessment for researchers and an ethics review system in FP7 and now also in Horizon Europe. And now they focus much stronger on data protection and the AI technologies. However, the ethics review process should be considered much more as a kind of advisory process here than a controlling process. And in addition, ALEA's European Code of Conduct is part of the contract of the European research funding system. That means everyone who receives funding of the European Union has signed that he's aware of this code. Researchers conducting non-medical studies within the legal framework of their country are in some cases not bound by specific regulations as they are for medical research. Often ethics review for such studies is not required by national laws, nor by professional laws or guidelines. Although funding agencies and scientific journals increasingly require ethics reviews for all studies involving human research participants, in some jurisdictions it's often difficult for these researchers to find an ethics committees. There are countries and research institutions where medical ethics committees share the task. There are ethics committees at various faculties, and sometimes we see central ethics committees at the level of the university or the research institutions. And in some smaller countries, there are central ethics committees for research outside biomedicine on the national level. Fact is, the practice are very different in Europe. Consequently, there is a great need to exchange experience on the topic of ethics review beyond biomedical research and to harmonize the procedures between the member states, but also between ethics review at the level of the European Commission on the one hand and the member states on the other hand. Therefore, EUREC drafted a position paper and wants to contribute to the increasing importance of ethics reviews of research projects outside the biomedical research sector. This is to harmonize the system of research ethics reviews in Europe and to encourage policymakers and research institutions to pay more attention to this issue. EUREC also invites non-medical ethics committees to exchange experience between medical research ethics committees and non-medical research ethics committees, just to learn how do you do it in your country. And that this has a huge impact. And we therefore want not only to help to facilitate the development of research ethics committees in other areas than medical research, but also to ensure that these developments promote dialogue within ethics. And above all, these considerations should not hinder research or create undue bureaucratic burdens. Moreover, ethics committees should by no means patronize researchers, but should sharpen their own ethical reflection. It is also important from an ethical perspective that research is free and remains free. So research may only be restricted on the basis of other fundamental human rights. And in this situation, EUREC can help with its experience. Against this background, EUREC has decided to actively participate in the monitoring of research process and to take part in Horizon 2020 projects, which focus on the ethical assessment of new and emerging technologies and the related challenges for research ethics committees, and also where projects consider the development of new teaching and training materials and research ethics and research integrity, and the projects that are related to new communication platforms such as the Embassy of Good Science and INERI. So what can we learn from medical recs to ethics reviews in the non-medical sectors? And when I'm saying learning, I do not mean teaching, but more sharing experiences. And I do pick up only some issues that are useful for REC members, which I think are useful for REC members. So it is to start national and European networking at a very, very early stage to exchange experience and to set standards, that we learn around these new developments from our neighborhood countries. Second aspect is to include dialogues with the affected stakeholders early, publishers, funders, lay people, users, on a permanent level. I mean, in medical recs, there are laypersons mandatory. I heard only from a few non-medical recs that they have laypersons included. But from this perspective of stakeholder involvement and participation of civil society, it is an important aspect to consider. Many research ethics committees and REC members would argue that it is important to avoid administrative burden for researchers and RECs. Often it depends, of course, on the legal and institutional requirements, but strict administration can also be a parameter of a fair treatment of researchers by ethics committees. So administration has both sides, fairness, but also a kind of bureaucratic burden. A second aspect is that we should avoid a general concern that it might be helpful to consider ethical review as a consultative process rather than a controlling process. And this leads to another aspect, to think about an ethics review process instead of just ex ante as a kind of more procedural advice. I mean, for medical recs, usually they see the project protocol before the research starts, and then they see only other aspects of the proceedings when something went wrong or there are very substantial changes. But we consider more and more whether it's more efficient to have an ethics review considered as a kind of procedural advice, so as a procedural consultative process. Another issue is that RECs and research institutions should use the freedom of not having everything regulated in a law as an advantage. So in drug research, in research with medical devices, there are clear laws how ethics reviews are included, and this is of course not the case in computer sciences, physics, or mathematics. And I'm personally a little bit worried that if we in the European Ethics Committees community do not get together better, network and exchange ideas, then the demand for legislation will follow because the situation is so heterogeneous. So it's very much on us whether we can avoid more types of regulation. And my last point here is we should also look at the aspect to offer training materials, not only on ethics as ethics, but also on the procedures and the administrative aspects of ethics reviews. My last slide is on the ethical principles. We've seen this already in other talks and discussions today, and of course that's not my main topic. Nevertheless, it seems helpful to me that the ethics review is guided by clear ethical criteria that were systematically developed for medicine and medical research, for example, by Tom Beecham and Jim Childress, but which have proven to be universal, based on a common morality independent of an underlying moral theory, both in relation to different cultures and to different scientific disciplines. The principles autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice already been mentioned. And we can learn from the medical recs experience that we need to make an effort to interpret and apply them to specific research contexts. Beneficence in particular is difficult to interpret when we refer it not only to a research participant, but also to a group or even to a society, or one step further to environment or culture. As a general rule, the focus here in medical recs is only on research participants. And what we always discuss particularly intensively in medical recs is the range and the assessment of risks. It's often a balancing act between non-maleficence and justice for a group or society. We already had this point in the keynote this morning. Which risk is acceptable, which is not, which is minimal. Again and again, lists are discussed with examples of what is possible and what is not possible for medical regs. And I'm personally very much in favor of such a list because I think it gives orientation. Other colleagues argue against it because they say that methods are constantly changing and it could tempt people to take risks just because it's not mentioned in the list. Anyway, this seemed to be a new challenge for risk in computer sciences to assess clearly how can we evaluate risk in a proper way. And my hope is that we will be able to meet these challenges in the future also with the help of a networking process together with EUREC, with ENERI and the Embassy of Good Science, where EUREC is a central partner and contributor. And I'm convinced that our academic and practical reflection on ethical issues of research in technical disciplines and what they mean for the relation between science and society with regard not only to trustworthy AI, but also to trustworthy research need to go hand in hand with the development of a European strategy for an ethics review system in those research subjects. But it's also my conviction that in all of this, we must not and should not establish an excessive bureaucratic burden, but rather we should cleverly use existing infrastructures and not think that every research project must be subject to an ethics review. Thank you very much for your attention.